Hi everyone, this is Journey to Authenticity. I'm Sarah Hart. My guest today is Jasun Horsley. Jasun is an existential detective in chronic confessional mode, Socratian podcaster and author of a series of books on cultural programming, hierarchical systems of abuse, the cult-like nature of society, and collective dissociation and alienation. His latest work is 16 Maps of Hell, Unraveling Hollywood Superculture. So, Jasun, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sarah.
You know, I hadn't actually, I have to be honest, I hadn't come across your books before. I happened to land on an interview that you'd done with Sean Atwood on YouTube, and I just felt pulled to watch it. I found the interview absolutely fascinating. There were so many parts of it that just struck me. But the reason why I invited you on the show was to talk about what you described as this quest to reclaim your life force. And you said that a large part of that was, quote, curing yourself of Hollywood. And so, I thought the first question to be able to enter that conversation would be just, how would you describe Hollywood and its influence on our conditioning and why somebody would seek to cure themselves of it?
Well, first thing that came to mind there is the cliche, Hollywood's not a place, it's a state of mind. And I think it's somewhere in the book I address that it's more than one thing when we use the term Hollywood. So obviously it's a place, it's also a state of mind, it's also a culture. And as a culture, I think it's kind of emblematic as well as symptomatic of a larger culture. Like Hollywood is a very specific, it's an industry, it's a movie industry. So it has specific products, and you could say it has specific values and aesthetics, but my sense of it, and obviously this is very personal, is that it's kind of the most visible, the most tangible, and the most proactive aspect of our culture. So the values that we see being propagated by Hollywood, they might be more extreme, they might be more obviously commercialized and kind of simplified, but they're still pretty universal in the Western world. And so I think the whole thing with Hollywood, it's kind of a symbol, but it's also more than a symbol. But the idea to me, or as I've come to understand it over the years, is that it's offering a counterfeit for experience. Now, obviously that's literally true in terms of why we go to movies. We like to enter into fantasies. We like to experience a surrogate reality. It's called escapism. But it's also true at the level, if we think of Hollywood as an institution and a kind of cultural front line, if you will, that people aspire to. I certainly did. Mm-hmm. And the stories we hear about Hollywood, the ideas we have about it as this, well, I mean, there are two opposing viewpoints, but they're kind of compatible as well. One is it's this place of corruption and money grubbing and exploitation and crass commercialization and all that. But the other is it's this artistic center where creativity happens. And the general view is it's both, and that somehow they're compatible. But that my view is they're not really compatible. And the view of Hollywood that's becoming more popular is the view that it's a place of abuses and exploitations. And that's clearly completely incompatible with the idea that it's this wonderful kind of bohemian environment where very creative people go and they do creative things. So what I'm trying to get here in a bit of a roundabout way is that culture itself offers this counterfeit for a direct lived experience of nature, and that involves storytelling and fantasies and confabulations and so on and so forth, and there's a sort of perpetuating of the myth there, by which the place that creates the dreams itself becomes this kind of dream world that we dream of entering into. So when I talk about trying to get Hollywood out of my system, there's two things. One is this, that I was engendered with this desire to succeed in Hollywood, literally in my case, but that's part of a larger complex where I wanted to join the culture and become a somebody in the culture, and to succeed, you know, to establish some sort of success in the world. And that was incepted in me very young, and that drove me for many, many years. To some extent, it still does. That's why I say I'm still trying to kind of extract this implant from my system. And of course, it was combined with the appeal of the movies themselves and how I used the movies to escape reality. And by doing that, they became part of my inner reality. Like the way we escape into a movie, it's not just that we pass the time by staring at images. It's working because we're suspending disbelief, and so we're internalizing those images, and we're letting the stories and the characters and so on occupy us, colonize us. And I see that those are sort of like missionaries, you know, that go into these foreign lands, and they were often working for the government. They're often spies, intelligence operatives. So whether or not they actually believed in the religion, they were very useful to occupy a country and infiltrate it. So I see it like that Hollywood is a delivery device for ideological viruses, if you will, memes, that if we take on the stories, we identify with the actors or the filmmakers and so on, the artists that we admire, then we're unconsciously taking on the values that they carry, and that these values, they belong to a hidden reality, which isn't, it's not the Hollywood that we think. Hollywood isn't what we think it is. This is what I explore in my latest book, that it's a combination of various things, and that the cultural aspect about creating art and telling stories is possibly secondary, and that the abuses and the crimes that we hear more and more about that come out of the entertainment industry or that are rife within it aren't just side effects. They seem to be central to the way that kind of culture operates, and they indicate the true values that are hidden behind it.
So there's sort of like this, what I'm hearing is that it's alluring. I mean, we can all get that Hollywood draws us all in, right? It's got this false sense of reality that we get sucked into and we kind of want to identify with. But this is almost a smoke screen for something behind, as though it's trying to influence society and sway it in some way. It's
a seduction, I would say. And one of the metaphors I used a while back was, it's rather an unpleasant one. So hopefully we will get to the life force and the positive, you know, before our time is up. But somebody who's a sexual predator, in order to be effective, and particularly preying on children, but I mean that's the example that I've used. I mean, it's a very visceral one, and it's a terrible reality, but we're all aware of it to one degree or another. And well, I mean, we used to have this idea of the stranger danger, that a child predator was some, you know, guy in a raincoat hanging around schoolyards, and who you would generally stay away from. And as soon as you see him, you would think he's a shady guy, even if he wasn't hanging around schoolyards. But in fact, that kind of predator probably isn't very effective. That's probably more just some lonely, sad guy who's stealing, you know, women's underwear. An effective predator is one who can not only charm the children but charm the parents, and so he or she has to maintain a very powerful illusion, a spell even, that they're trustworthy, that good, kind people, that they're charismatic, they're entertaining them. There are various different ways that a predator would Ted Bundy comes to mind. He was considered very charming, and he knew how to put people's guard down and instill with a great deal of trust, more than average amount of trust, so that then his victims would be easily preyed upon. So I'm using this just because it's easier to talk about specific examples than to talk about a whole institution or a whole culture. But I think the same principle applies, that there's a different agenda to our culture and society, specifically Hollywood, but also, I mean, the reason I say Hollywood's not what it seems specifically, I could say because it's combined with organized crime, there's an overlap there, and also intelligence agencies and operations. So things we've heard recently about Jeffrey Epstein, for example, that's also woven into the Hollywood culture. So it's not what it seems in that very literal sense, and specifically in terms of its agenda, it's not merely about creating entertainment to make money, much less to entertain us. It's also about casting this spell in order to exploit us and to gather a resource, if you will, a kind of, I mean, we'll get very deep there, but we could get to the life force there. But what does a predator prey upon? They are trying to get something. It's a kind of vampiric quality to a predator, a child predator. They're looking for an experience of the life force that they don't have because of their own damaged nature. And the child victim, who's innocent and pure relatively, is both easy to prey upon and also has that resource. So I would say that Hollywood is like that on a macro scale. Not only, of course, but even a child predator isn't only a predator. They may actually genuinely be charming. They may even be genuinely kind in some ways, but they have this pathology that's driving them.
We find that, I think, now the more that it starts to surface about these people that were held up in society that managed to manipulate and deceive masses of people in the community, not just the children, to be able to get away with their crimes. So Hollywood, in a sense, is like the mass deception, I suppose, by kind of definition of what they do anyway. They're that's their purpose, right? That's their role, is to deceive and create an illusion. So you've spoken about that in terms of the child predators, but would you say that that is actually part of the agenda and what is going on behind the scenes, that there is that's actually playing a role behind there?
Yeah, I think it's central to it. It's strange because it's almost as though, I mean, there are levels of reality, I suppose we could say, and so it's almost as though much of the stuff that goes on the surface almost seems like a metaphor for something. And so, like, I've been talking metaphorically, but it's actually literally true, as you're asking. But the literal truth itself is also sort of metaphorical, in that there's something about child sacrifice, exploiting innocence, that is metaphorically central to this kind of pathology, which has to do with the life force and this pure essence that is absolutely good. And I mean, that's the nature of it. That's the nature of goodness, is the purity of the life force and of nature, even though, I mean, nature is a harsh place as well. And so there's something about the exploitation of one's own life force. I mean, this is all nested around trauma and sourced in trauma. So they're preying on children. I believe it is very central to Hollywood. And of course, there are a lot of children who go to Hollywood. Their parents take them there and hope, they want them to be successful and so on. And so, there have been open testimonies that the casting couch extends to children. So that this is a literal layer of the reality, but it's also something deeper, which is that this sort of pathology does seem to be sourced in a loss of, a traumatic loss of innocence, a traumatic betrayal. And so there's something called the reenactment compulsion, which is that when we've had some trauma that we couldn't process, we couldn't resolve, and it gets pushed down into the unconscious, and so we're carrying it as this unconscious drive in our lives. One of the ways we try and get free of it is we unconsciously reenact it. And I would say
Yeah.
that the more unconsciously we reenact it, and the more in denial we are, the more likely we are to do so in a destructive way, as in we might actually take it out on somebody else. So then you have somebody has these terrible betrayal traumas in their past as a child. They want to reject and even kill the child in themselves because there's so much suffering associated with it. And so then they enact that by stalking children. So it's
Sort of like when the innocence in someone's been lost, they try to, it's a misguided and perverted way of trying to reconnect with their own innocence. I suppose children are just close to source in the sense that they're, like you said, they're pure and innocent.
Yeah,
but
so
it's
they're trying to
perverted.
reclaim something in a way that they want to destroy it. So the unconscious drive is to destroy it. And they do that, I mean, we all have some degree of this dysfunction in our lives, do it to our own life force as well. Like we want to claim it because it makes us feel good, but the act of trying to control the life force can kill it.
So that's in the sort of much deeper sense of the trauma that's going on behind the scenes in Hollywood. How would you say, you said before that you feel that they're manipulating and exploiting our trauma as the viewers and consumers of Hollywood? How would you say they're doing that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the obvious example I would say is that they create fantasies, and the fantasies, as I said already, they're for escaping from reality. And in order for them to be effective as escapist fantasies, they have to appeal to us in certain ways. And specifically, they have to appeal to the part of us that wants to escape. And so the desire to escape from reality into fantasy is, in psychology, is called dissociation. And that is a side effect of trauma. So there's a very close parallel between the machinery of Hollywood, if you will, that, as you said, it's the business of deception, getting us to suspend our disbelief and enter into these fantasy realms in such a way that we really forget about our physical bodies and our actual lives and our reality. That's the idea. That correlates exactly with something that we learn, in quotes. It's not really learning, but we develop the ability very young if we've been traumatized. So that's a general comparison, but then there are the very specifics, which is that, and it's a huge subject, but I mean, I first began to explore it with a book called Seen and Not Seen, Confessions of a Movie Autist, which was written about my love of movies, and specifically I was referring to earlier writing I wrote about movies when I was more naive, and I just wrote about movies as a movie fan and as a movie critic. And I was looking back over those writings, and I was reevaluating my relationship, in quotes, to those movies, and including to the people who made them. And I started to see how the specifics of my own trauma and my family environment, let's say, that the way that my love wasn't received, and I didn't receive the love I needed, which is basic betrayal trauma, one way or another, however extreme. It's really that. It created these specific holes in me, these specific needs, these specific kind of hubs of despair and anguish, and so I unconsciously went looking for individuals. For me, it's Clint Eastwood, who resembled my father and was a strong man the way my father wasn't a strong man, and was, he's there fighting evil, and I was, there was abuse in my family environment and nobody was there to protect me. So you can see how that need, I'd be looking for this strong man hero, and then Clint Eastwood just falls into my field and I lock onto him. It's like bonding or imprinting. And then specifically the stories, and I write about what's called Hollywood revenge fantasies. They are geared, they're tailor-made to appeal to psyches that have been experienced traumatic powerlessness. We've been victims in some form or another, and been powerless to do anything about it. And so there's been not just the anguish and the grief and the terror of it, but the rage as well, because rage is a defensive thing. And so Hollywood, and we can see it, all these movies that are, they're feeding the bloodlust, we're very aware of that, but that's just the most visible level. There's much, I mean, romantic comedies, they exploit loneliness. I mean, so there's a whole spectrum. One doesn't just have to look at the obvious violent, so-called cathartic revenge movies. They're not cathartic, but one can look at all of them through that lens, that they're tailor-made to appeal to the part of us that was cut off from the life force and so is perpetually dissatisfied. And then they provide this candy, like candy for a kid, that will rot our teeth and turn us into addicts. And eventually, you know, we go on to harder stuff. Eventually, we're mainlining heroin, you know, figuratively or literally. Yeah. So that's the, like I say, it's a very large spectrum and it's a very large subject, but I think it can be narrowed down to the specifics of an individual.
Yeah, so it's interesting because when you describe it like that, I kind of see that that's why everyone has been attracted by Hollywood, because all of us to some degree have that sense of a void, whatever that trauma or wounding is, to varying degrees and depths, and also its nature, like loneliness or etc. you described. And I can say that from my own experience. It's almost as if I had in the past put these individuals on pedestals, like the demigod concept of these Hollywood actors or actresses. And I can see how much that creates this disconnection from ourselves, like we're always trying to fill the void outside of ourselves. Like if I get closer to looking like this person or having what they have, all these external factors keeps us, it's like the ultimate spiritual bypassing, because it keeps us separate from looking within, connecting to our own wisdom or essence, etc. And it maintains the disconnection. And I suppose in that disconnection, like you described, we're easy to exploit.
Yeah. So there's an expression, the cure that almost works is the most addictive thing. So Hollywood, it gives us a temporary sense of satisfaction, but it also feeds our sense of dissatisfaction for precisely the reasons you said. Well, it feeds that part of us that believes we can find what we're looking for outside of ourselves in the other, which, you know, is hard enough or perhaps even futile enough, but certainly frustrating enough if we try to do that with partners. You know, and those are people that we know. And then we're talking about people that we'll never know. As parasocial relationships, they are like the gods. They are, I could say the literal, but certainly the very precise updating of the old parasocial relationship that we used to have with the gods, with one key distinction perhaps, which is the gods, because they were gods, there was really, I mean, maybe it's just belief, but still it's worth thinking about. There was a way to connect to them internally. Maybe they did represent something within us that was good, like the planets, let's say. Mars represents, you know, our anger, our energy, our sexuality. So there is something there. Whereas Brad Pitt, what does he represent in me? Really, you know, nothing. I mean, my desire to be famous, probably, and to be good looking. Very superficial stuff, right?
And I'm going to just use a really simple example. Let's say the romantic comedy. Okay, we've got the demigod of the actor and actress that we think is so beautiful. Then it's like we internalize that belief system that this is what love looks like. This is what romance should be. This is what passion should be. This is what a life partner should be. And then we're like projecting that on every single person we ever date or we end up being with. And that's just, I suppose, an example of how that implants us, and then our whole lens of looking at the world and our expectations that we place on ourselves and others get completely warped.
Yeah. And you know, there's the conscious level that you've just described, and most people would be conscious of that. I was conscious that I looked up to Clint Eastwood and I wanted to be like him, and I, you know, tried to do my hair like him and so on. And I was conscious of the gulf, you know, that I would never actually be that. That's the conscious level. But there's a much deeper level I mean, with everything, we know the unconscious is there and that's in the body, but that's what's happening in the body. And one of the things that I wasn't aware of, and I'm still not fully because it's so deep, is that when we watch, and Socrates wrote about this actually, I found various sources for this, and Nietzsche as well. I think he called them ghosts of reality, but when we watch people performing, being, and we just watch people, they've got the mirror neurons in the brain, we internalize those movements, and the more we bond to them, the more we would do that, and vice versa. The more we do it, the more we bond to them. And we will, it's like because we're mimetic, human beings are mimetic. That's probably the primary way we learn as children, is by mimesis or through imitation. And imitation isn't just as literal as it says me actually trying to do my hair like Clint Eastwood. It's an internalized thing. When we watch figures on the screen and we identify them because we get pulled into the story, what I think happens is we start to internalize qualities of those individuals. So it really is like a colonization. And the thing is that we're mimetic beings, and we're, first and foremost, we're natural beings, as in we're physical. And so if I'm emulating Clint Eastwood, say, the example I use in the book is Kirk Douglas, because he's, there's been actual testimonies about what a terrible person Kirk Douglas was. Like, he raped Natalie Wood very violently, and just, a really awful human being. He's still alive, actually. We would think that we were just emulating the characters he plays, but actually no, because mimesis is about a bodily level of affect. So it's like you say, your parents can, if a parent hits you and says, "Don't hit," what are you going to learn? You're not going to hear the "don't hit." You've been shown that hitting is the way. And so yeah, children, they learn, in quotes, they copy their parents' behavior, not what their parents say. And so it's the same with these movie stars and the movies we watch. Whatever those actors and those people on the screen are really like, that's, regardless of the characters we're playing, I think that's the main part of what we end up emulating. And it's very insidious. I mean, it's it's a big subject, so maybe just we'll end there. Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of fascinating, because that's taken it to a deeper level for me to realize I could acknowledge that with our parents. That's how, in a sense, so much of our generational patterns repeat. And even when we don't want to, we end up going, "Oh my God, I sound like my mum." And we've taken that on, but actually these demigods, these people, become so ingrained and almost create this generational patterning that happens. But like you said, we could go down one route really deep, or many different avenues. So I'm quite interested to hear where and why this switch point was for you, where you were like, okay, you were allured in by Hollywood, you wanted to enter it. What was the switch to go, "Oh, I need to get it out of me"?
Well, it wasn't overnight. It wasn't at one point. And hindsight is 2020, of course. So one of the stories I tell at the beginning of 16 Maps of Hell is my first trip to Hollywood, which was when I was 20, and I was on a pilgrimage. I'd moved to New York. I had money from an inheritance, and I was writing a script, or I'd written a script about a serial killer. And I drove across country to Hollywood to, I suppose, I was thinking of, I don't know what I was thinking, but I just definitely wanted to go there. And I fell ill the night after I got there. It was Christmas morning. I fell terribly ill, and I was ill for 2 weeks in the Holiday Inn. I was so ill, feverish, and I could barely even think. I couldn't eat for 2 weeks. So it was one of the worst times of my life, and it was the beginning of a chronic fatigue syndrome, so 20 years of physical illness. Now, of course, I'm not blaming that on Hollywood, but I also don't believe in coincidences, particularly not when they're that large. Like, to me, Hollywood was the place where my dreams would come true, I thought. And in fact, I entered into a nightmare the day I arrived there. Now, that to me, with hindsight, looks like, well, that was my body was telling me something. It was really responding in this visceral way. And I say, I don't literally think that Hollywood made me ill, but somehow there was a convergence of things there. So so, you know, if that didn't wake me up, and it certainly didn't, because that was the beginning of my attempt to make it in Hollywood. I was another 20 years until I turned 40, in fact. And I better keep this succinct because there's so many stories I could tell. But I would say that the reevaluation probably began in my 40th year, and there were many things that began that were really one thing, which where it was together. I mean, these things together were, I would say that they were like a stirring of my life force that began to compel me in some way to question at a deeper level, because before that I'd been questioning superficially. So I'd written books about Hollywood. Of course I knew that Hollywood was corrupt, and of course I knew that Hollywood movies were propaganda a lot of the time, but I also thought that The Godfather or Taxi Driver or The Wild Bunch were works of art, and I kind of worshipped at the altar of these movies. Blue Velvet was another. And that split in me was somehow, like many splits in us, one that I just let be there. I mean, I'm not quite sure, you know. It's like, how do you paper over the cracks of inconsistency? It's something we do learn as children in a traumatic environment. We have to ignore the evidence, or forget the evidence, or forget what we know, that we're in an abusive environment if we are, or neglectful or whatever, because that's all we've got. So you could say that Hollywood, in some sense, was all I had in terms of that dream. So even though I saw all these inconsistencies, I just kept this double thing that, yes, it's corrupt, but somehow if I can make it in Hollywood, I can use it as a means to do something pure and good. That somehow it was still possible within the system, you know, changing the system by joining it, that idea. Millions of people have that. Think about all the people who become lawyers or police, and then whatever, they either become totally disillusioned or they become corrupt at the end of it. They say, well, it's the only way, right? So I was trying to do that, thinking that I would somehow be able to not compromise myself, and actually do some good, like serve the spirit, as I saw it back then, by creating these works of art. So that kind of rationalization saw me through for 20 years. And as for what actually changed, as I say, it was just a general thing that I think that my sense of my life force and how wounded it was combining with, or leading to, or resulting from a growing awareness that my beliefs about things were seriously deluded. So it didn't actually start with Hollywood. It started with my spirituality, because I was hell-bent as an occultist shaman, practicing psychedelic shaman ceremonies. You know, again, this is a whole other area to, you know, not get into. And I just came such a cropper with that. Like I call it my Icarus phase. I just plummeted to the ground with such a thud that I barely survived. And what choice do you have? If you're lying broken on the ground, surrounded by wax and feathers, you've got to actually admit to yourself that that was a bad idea, flying to the sun. So I was in that phase of, okay, I was really wrong about a lot of stuff. And so weirdly, I'm just thinking this now, this was the same period where I was got the closest to making it in Hollywood. I started having these scripts read and almost accepted, and my 40th year, which was, I'd said I will quit my Hollywood dream if nothing happens by the time I turn 40. And I actually got an email on my 40th birthday saying, I want somebody who wants to read your script. So I'm like, it's a sign.
Yeah.
Right? And anyway, so that went on for some months, and then it went nowhere. So I was like, well, what kind of sign was that? And then there's the period after that. I mean, it's 13 years ago now, but these last 13 years, I've been reevaluating everything. You could say, well, everything that's really close to me that has provided me with what I call crucial fictions, like ways to maintain my idea about myself and to keep myself going with this sense of purpose that's sourced in my mind. So there was spirituality, there was things around UFOs, there was being a writer, but Hollywood was the original one. So I think because of that, it's like the last one I could get to because it was the deepest, perhaps.
Deepest.
Yeah.
It's like you're describing these two sides of yourself, though. There's like this, your body and some, I don't know, intuitive part of you that's telling you one story, like a total collapse and all of those things. And then the mind that's like wants to cling to the stories to convince yourself, and seeking that like confirmation bias, like, oh, this is a sign. But also, I think it could be mirrored in the concept of like a spiritual awakening, in that bridging moment of going, actually, if I am to let go of these beliefs, let's say an idea around Hollywood being something I can change and there is good in it and all of that, what does that mean for all the other parts of my life? And that big void that you kind of have to sink into when you let go of something like that.
Yeah, that's why I call it a crucial fiction, that our identities
really
depend on these stories that we tell ourselves, and we tell ourselves them so well and for so long that we forget. We suspend disbelief and then forget that we've done so. So we're lost in a movie that we've generated. We write it and direct it. Like when we dream at night, we know that we do that. When we're awake, we don't notice that we're doing it, but we are still. We're still doing it. So every conversation, every interaction gets pulled into this movie, this internal movie. And the movie, like real movies, has a plot and it has a protagonist, we're it. And the plot will be, whatever it is. It might be enlightenment. I mean, it can be or service of God. It can be the highest, loftiest story. But the fact it's a story that our mind is telling us makes it the counterfeit, because the life force doesn't work that way. It's I think well, I don't want to fall back on cliche, but I suppose rather than do that, then I could say that, because I was going to say it's about being in the present, but if we think about all the things that are happening every moment that we're picking up through sensation, there's no way that the mind could turn those into a story, see? Right?
Yeah, and it works
so
faster
much.
anyway. It's too much. Yeah,
It's too much, and
billions of...
it doesn't make a story. Right? A story is beginning, middle, and end, and it has a victory, it has whatever, a tragedy, or a genre. That whole thing about stories, and realizing this about myths as well. Like we think of myths, we think movies are kind of bad, kind of crappy, but myths are great because of Joseph Campbell or Jung or whatever. But it's all stories. I mean, myths also reduce things to unreality, because life can't be narrativized like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a really good segue to kind of go into the process of your deprogramming. But just before we go there, kind of in the same idea as what you had of thinking, if I enter Hollywood, I can go with from heart and from a good place, etc. Do you think that the people that are in Hollywood, that the large proportion are similar to you, in that there is a total innocence in them? And do you sort of think that there's this threshold that when you get to, you have to almost be invited in, and to be invited in there's a trade of some sort, like for the fame and the influence and the power and the money, you're compromised, or you're either involved or complicit in something darker?
Yeah, and it's possible there's a threshold, as you say, but I kind of doubt it, because it seems to me that it would be an incremental thing, and that the willingness to compromise is going to be checked and registered very early on. I mean, of course, in many cases, it does start with the casting couch, so you can't have a more, palpable opportunity to compromise than that. And of course, if you do that, if you submit to the casting couch, then you've really invested. It's going to be much harder to maintain your integrity a bit later on, if it means losing the headway that you've already made, and you had to sacrifice that to make it. You see what I mean? So you're likely to keep on making these sacrifices and compromises once you've made the first, and that is a big one. So that, I mean, maybe I don't know how many people in Hollywood, needless to say, got their first break through the casting couch, but even if it's only 20% or something, it's still highly significant, and it indicates that there isn't really much innocence there, except in the broadest sense, as in people believing that they want to do good and that they can do good. And the thing about that, I don't think that's a good qualifier for innocence or a good determinant of innocence, because I think Hitler believed that. Sorry to use Hitler, he's an easy target, but you know, whoever we think is the worst person, because you know, DT now for most people, but they all think that they're doing good. Of course they do. Nobody sits there thinking I'm doing bad. So I don't think that could be the determinant. I think the determinant really is how much has a person, and I thought about this for myself, that one of the reasons I could never make headway in Hollywood, I think, or maybe the reason, was I don't like to bullshit. I just feel bad if I bullshit. Yeah, and it's not, I don't see it as a moral thing, but maybe it is, but to me it's just, it's so hard anyway, just living, right? So that, and pretending makes it harder. So I guess maybe I'm lucky in that way, but for whatever reason, I find pretending to be repellent. And I really think that in Hollywood, it is, you know, the land, I mean, pretending is their business. You probably couldn't really get anywhere if you had that aversion. So I think that's why I didn't get anywhere. So then I think that would be incremental, wouldn't it? Like a person, how long do you keep on pretending and get further and further alienated from your own life force, which is probably the only true correspondent for conscience, if you see what I mean? If that isn't a mental, like what prevents a person from doing certain things, their social conditioning is only going to work for up to a certain point. You see what I mean? And if someone's driven to make it in Hollywood, for example, but also in other industries, I think what happens, I imagine what happens is that whatever their social conditioning, they might have been Christian, they might have been raised by, you know, with very strong values, but if we enter into an environment where the value system is totally different and possibly inverted, then little by little, of course, we're going to lose our convictions. We're going to start compromising what we do and what we even believe, and we'll start believing, taking on a different set of values. So I don't think that having a set of values protects people, you know, who are going into Hollywood. On the contrary, really, I think, because values in this sense are quite superficial, that
it can be manipulated to fit their values if they're good at identifying what a person's values are quick off the bat.
Yeah.
And now I'm sort of even saying it, sort of, as you described yourself, I would go, yes, you're not an easy target for them in a way. But very, maybe in the same way as Hollywood is luring us in from birth, like this is an incremental indoctrination, almost the mind control aspect of it. They could do this very quickly with people to test. It's just pushing the boundary a little bit. How much further are they willing to go? How much are they willing to compromise themselves in a way that makes them feel uncomfortable? And that can just be built upon layer, I suppose. And then without I suppose it's just whether at what level do they become conscious that they are doing something not good?
It's an eternal question for probably for lots of people, and for me too. And I mean, one thing it brings me back to is the earlier point I made about predators being very charming and even having good points. And so perhaps it's a good idea to introduce here that the notion of psychological fragmentation, which is another symptom of trauma and a result of dissociation. And when we go into movies, that's like dissociative identity disorder. If you're an actor, you're practicing dissociative identity disorder. There's something around Hollywood that really is a sort of written large, or a kind of exteriorization of what we maybe know and to some extent experience about internal fragmentation, which is in in an extreme case is somebody like Sybil, you know, the famous person they made a movie about with Sally Field, who actually or MK Ultra victims, who actually has a number of different personalities with names and everything, and they move like CDs on a multiple CD player. One moves forward and another moves back. Well, I think that is real. There are cases like that, but I would say that those are extreme, and for most of us, it's much more subtle. We will just be different people in different ways and feel differently about things according to who we're with and according to circumstances. But it does include a kind of forgetfulness, an ability to forget. So, so in this sense, how a person compromises themselves, and at what point do they become conscious of what they're involved in? Well, and like I said, for me, at what point did I actually really start to seriously question this? I can't really say, because it's I'm not whole anyway. So the things that we don't want to see or admit to because they're inconvenient are the first things we'll suppress. So I think in Hollywood, probably what's going on, and this would make it so maddening to try and get our heads around. Like, I always think of George Clooney for some reason, because he seems so nice, you know. And you watch him, and I have this thought: could he actually be, sorry for your listeners, but, you know, raping children or doing these horrible, you know, it just seems so inconceivable to me. And yet, and I have to remind myself, well, if people are fragmented, it's literally like they're different people.
Yeah.
And so somebody, it's Jekyll and Hyde, somebody, and this would be obviously very useful for predators, but also for actors. It's what actors do. You know, a good actor can play a really kind, loving husband, or he can play a brutal villain. And it's the same actor, it's the same body. So yeah, it's I think it's a lot more complicated than we imagine. Like, we try and fit it into these, and
These
Hollywood's
boxes.
partly to blame, actually. We try and make it into this linear story where the good guys are good and the bad guys are bad, but it's just not like
It's
that.
just not really like that. And yeah, that kind of concept of compartmentalization, we do that on the most subtle level every single day. But Hollywood could just be the ultimate polarized version of compartmentalization, just this one total illusion fantasy and this other thing that's happening that, like you say, when they're in it, in those different personalities or fragmented parts of themselves, they completely disconnect from the other. And then when they swap out of it, it's completely suppressed, so they can convince themselves of anything or stay blind to anything that they're getting up to.
I think it's even almost symptomatic of this, because I've looked at this as well, how trauma can be used to create charisma. So I think there's something about, and it's also in the Jungian psychology, you know, that the darker the shadow, the brighter the you know, the ego, or the you know, more twisted up the id is, the more the superego will compensate for that. So I think there's something about this that,
Michael
in a way,
Jackson's comes to mind with that one.
and I don't know if you know the Oscar Wilde thing, the picture of Dorian Gray. Do you know that story? Well, it's about an artist, a young man who has this painting done of him, and there's a spell in the painting. And so what happens is that he's a beautiful young man, and he becomes a hedonist, or he is a hedonist. And as he pursues the path of hedonism and corruption and, you know, venality and vice, he stays young and beautiful looking, but all his vices show up on the painting. So the painting gets uglier and uglier while he stays the same. And so I use that as the metaphor for Hollywood. And it's as though actually the glamour of Hollywood and the thing that we're so spellbound for really is the clue. That's the tell, in a certain sense, because nothing is that good. Nothing's that sparkly and glamorous. Life simply isn't like that. That's sort of the point. And there's something also in psychology you can imagine. You said Michael Jackson. Imagine being worshipped by millions of people and having the pressure to be this godlike paragon of virtue. while being an ordinary person. What happens to all that dark, nasty stuff? Well, you have to disown it, and you have to repress it, and you have to conceal it. But of course, it's going to come out. So then it's like you've got to have this compartment, like the image of a dungeon comes to mind. You go down in the dungeon and you do these terrible things. Or Neverland, in Michael Jackson's case, you create this Neverland, this fantasy realm, and you're safe there, or Elvis at Graceland, and that's where you let your real, well, maybe you shouldn't say the real, but that's where you let all the dark, nasty stuff come out in order to maintain. So that it's like the two actually feed each other.
Yeah, like that saying, whatever we suppress finds a way to express. You just can't. It fragment. If just in our psyche's movement towards wholeness, it seems it will always try to find a way to express every aspect of ourselves. Just. Yeah. So coming to your process of this deprogramming and deconditioning, where's it taken you? What have you come to realize along the way? What's been the process for you? I mean, you've mentioned quite a bit already, but
yeah. Well, I suppose, I mean, one of the latest things that I've become aware of or started to consider is that the body really is, and certainly could be, more interesting than the mind. And that there's a whole realm of experience that I've marginalized for most of my life in favor of this kind of fun fairground carnival of fascinating things to play with up here. I say up here, I mean, where is the mind? We don't know, but we kind of identify it in the brain and behind the eyes. And so it's all hardwired to our sense of identity of who we are. And it's telling the story. It's like the projection, it's the movie theater, right? Or maybe that's the projection booth, and it projects outward through our eyes, and then our world becomes the movie theater. So it's something like that. And it really is just, it's almost, I mean, say from the neck up, because, you know, we want to act, we want to talk within this realm, but there's this whole life below the neck, the rest of the body all the way down to the feet, where, speaking personally, but I'm guessing this would apply to most other people who would be listening, my attention has hardly ever gone. It's hardly spent any time, you know, in 53 years, in there, or maybe in my first couple of years I was more there, but I don't remember those years. So I think, I mean, it's kind of a difficult question to answer in a certain sense, or the way I've chosen to answer it is a little bit difficult, because it's kind of, I'm kind of at the point now where I'm aware that the more talking I do and the more thinking I do, the more danger there is of just, you know, carrying on playing with these baubles that I've collected throughout my life, that they kind of mirror my sense of who I am. They're potentially part of my identity's crucial fiction. While meanwhile, the life of the body, there's so little to say about it. I mean, because one could talk meditation, and actually, in a certain sense, there's a lot to say, but it's, well, it's not so easy to talk about. And certainly it doesn't just come up organically. Like, you're not going to ask, hey, Jason, what's going on in your knees right now? How do you feel the spaces between your toes? These are not questions we're likely to be getting, right?
Yeah.
Actually, those are interesting questions, but they're not mentally stimulating.
Yeah.
They lead to a different sort of experience.
Inquiry.
Yeah, and we might end up actually being quiet, silent for 5 minutes, and then going, well, I think I felt a tiny twitch in my little toe. How about you, you know? Or we might say, my God, you know, I can't even feel my feet. We might start to notice how cut off we are. And of course, that's all relevant. So yeah, I mean, the life of the body, and the body is our direct experience of nature. And we talk about nature out there, but our nature is human nature. And our nature is mostly within us. And we've got the surface, that corresponds with our body image. So we have this idea about who we are, which is the image of who we are. but most of us is on the inside. If you're talking physically, nobody gets to see that, hopefully. And we're the only ones who can refer to that, and we don't. So, and that could be made to correspond with the kingdom is within you of the gospel, even if we want to, be spiritual or be, soundbitey about whatever. But I mean, it does have a profound spiritual dimension to it, or resonance, for me anyway. But the actual experience of it is pretty boring, actually. And yet, does it have to be? Does it have to be? I mean, the act of breathing can be a wonderful thing, right? Just really feeling the breath, and we can imagine, perhaps, maybe we have to imagine how much the cells of the body enjoy and flourish with every breath we take. That's an experience that's happening in the cells of our body, I guess. And I think it's available to us, that experience. But the mind is just like, what? Maybe, yeah, okay. And maybe it can build some concepts around it and then get there. But that wouldn't be it either. It really is just something that's happening right here with the breathing and the body. So that's my orientation more and more lately. And how it relates to deprogramming, fortunately, I remember, my mind didn't abandon me. I remembered your question. Is I would say that the programming, and I kind of want to put it in quotes, because programming is what we do with a computer, and we're not machines, but it is kind of appropriate because culture is not natural. There's an artificiality to culture. So it is like a program or an installation in the body. And I probably will have to refer to my work, my collaboration with Dave Oshana, who's this man in Finland, who's an English guy who became enlightened in 2000, as he describes it. And his description is that the connective tissue in the body, which is the fascia, that the kind of thoughts that we have, or rather, let's say, the affect in our body, the unpleasant sensations that we have in our body from very early on, that one of the ways we do, and they're very much in the connective tissue, as you can imagine, like that's a very sensitive part of the whole system that runs through the whole system. So that would feel the vibrations of unpleasant affect. One of the ways we deal with that is by dissociating, and part of the dissociation is thinking. So it's like we create these clusters of thoughts around a negative feeling, and because thinking is happening in the body, and I'm having to kind of guess and intuit this now, I'm not directly quoting Dave, those thoughts, they cluster around the affect. And so you could say that our thoughts get enmeshed or entangled in the connective tissue of the body as these many clusters throughout the whole body. And I've had visceral experiences of this throughout my life, which I refer to as chronic fatigue syndrome, which also involves these awful bodily sensations of like being caught in this toxic spider web. I call it the Grinch, and just like just my whole kind of body and being was just kind of trapped and contracted. I think that very much corresponds with what Dave's talking about, with the fascia getting embedded with these clusters of thought. And so how he describes it, that's our identity, essentially. Our identity is a whole mesh, sort of iron mesh of thoughts that have been tangled together over the years and got embedded in our nervous system, in the connective tissue there. And so they're trapping the life forces. They're preventing it from distributing freely or even going into our body. It's possible it doesn't even make it into our body. It gets stuck, at the head. And so the body kind of is withering away. I'm getting the image of a grey alien now. And the alternative to that is to let our consciousness go into that connective tissue and meet that stuff, meet those thoughts, meet our identity. But the experience really is of just going into the unpleasant sensations, and the sensations are also, it brings up emotions and thoughts and all kind. I mean, probably most people have had these experiences where they lie awake at night and they can't sleep and they feel like they're being assaulted by all these absurd and meaningless thoughts, but they're attacking in a certain sense. That feeling of being under attack by one's own consciousness. I think it relates to this, that there's this sort of parasitical identity that's installed itself in our nervous system. So this anyway is our programming. And it seems to me that although that's particular to us and relates to particular traumas, let's say, and imprints, it also is somehow informed, because it relates to our thinking and our imagining, by the culture itself. So you could say we're culturally programmed or conditioned, not just by our parents, but also by Hollywood, literally and figuratively, giving us these fantasies to tell ourselves, and these, coping mechanisms and these reassuring thoughts or self-punishing thoughts. And so all of that, we're being programmed then by a combination of trauma and the narratives that we're being handed. And so the deprogramming then, for me, is a combination of this body work, if you will, which isn't necessarily as any sort of discipline, although I have done various physical things, but it can just be, just observation. Combination of that, the body work, and well, of course, lived life, being married, just being triggered in life and feeling all the ways in which I'm very neurotic, and all that stuff that just goes on naturally if we're becoming aware and allowing ourselves to act more consciously, combined with all this writing I've been doing, which is and I think I mentioned this in the email, that my approach seems to be intuitively to use the world as a surgical mirror. So if I'm looking at the world and I'm looking at these different agendas, these different groups, these different institutions, these different narratives, these different systems and methodologies and philosophies and culture at large, let's say, specifically the areas that correspond to me, that I've been attracted to or enmeshed in, then I'm seeing the thing that has imprinted me. So although I can't see the imprint directly, I'm seeing, it's like seeing, well, literally like a stamp. You've got a rubber stamp on your forehead, and if I look at the stamp, I can intuit what the form is of the imprint. And somehow that seems to, it's not so much, I mean, what's doing the surgery isn't my mind. So it's not literally like I'm trying to remove the Clint Eastwood, implant in my psyche that says you too could be a Hollywood player. But that by putting my attention on it outside, my attention naturally is going to it on the inside as well, because it's mirroring it. And then as my attention goes to those areas, consciousness is going to where that part of the identity programming, and it dissolves, because the presence of consciousness itself displaces it, loosens it, and displaces it.
So it seems that part of it, of just having that awareness in that gap of awareness and placing a different tension or attention or creating new perception of it, it's like the mental implants kind of more spontaneously released. It's spontaneous. It's not that it's focused and deliberate. And the first part of what you said, well, I can definitely say that for myself and my own journey. It has been about releasing body memory, this stored up memory implicit in our nervous system, in our fascia. And it's interesting that you use the word thought that gets stuck in the fascia, because I haven't ever really thought about it like that. I thought about it more as trapped sensation and energy. That's a density that is to be released. And I found that for me, the most liberating part of that has been to go into my body using, I mean, the breath is a perfect entry point, like you said, something that's beyond thought. And that's the beauty of the breath. You have the conscious part where we can choose to breathe, and the unconscious part that we don't need to think about breathing. So it's like the bridge between the conscious and automatic part of our nervous system.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I am a thinker, for better or for worse. We used to have a thing in our toilet when I was growing up with that image of the thinker. Sometimes I sits and thinks, and sometimes I just sits. It was a joke, because we're sitting on the toilet when we see that. Anyway, that just came to mind. Like I have identified as a thinker, and for me, thinking was definitely central to my coping. So it would be probably more tangible in my case. But on the other hand, I think it is quite a radical idea or real possibility that thought itself is generated by the body. Well, what else would it be generated by? And so I remember I was reading Dostoevsky recently, or rereading Crime and Punishment, which I've read many times. I read it first at 20, and he talks about, very early on, he refers to Raskolnikov had a sensation of hatred. And it was so odd that I would have read that 30 years ago, because it's quite, to me now, it seemed that was so insightful that he recognized.
You remember it, so it made an impact.
I just reread it, but I didn't remember it as a thing. Like it didn't sink in all those other times. But now that I've come to see that things that I used to identify as thoughts and emotions, which are those things, but prior to that, they're sensations, that the body is just this full of sensations, and then that they translate somehow. They translate into feelings, emotions, thoughts, but it's all sourced through the body anyway. Maybe not in it, because then we have the question of the soul. There is something beyond the body, or there's an aspect of the body that is beyond what we're knowing, but it all comes through the body.
It's like a biological frequency instrument, whether it's picking up frequency on thought or feeling or emotion, sensation. It's just receiving that frequency through that different channel, or as it were.
So it's compartmentalization again. I would compartmentalize into thought, emotion, but and before that, synesthesia. It's just all perception.
Yeah, but also this all happening simultaneously as well.
Yeah.
So how would you say that this pathway has changed things in your life? In a sense, this new embodiment and awareness, how has it changed things for you?
Well, that's a good question. That's where the rubber meets the road. And it's not necessarily causal. I mean, the examples I would give won't be obviously causal, but they're complementary. So, corresponding with this trajectory, which is since I turned 40, really, I met David Sharner, but that wasn't causative, because I just emailed back and forth with him for about 3 or 4 years before I even started really working with him. I met my wife. That was much more causative. Moved to Canada, British Columbia. It's just beautiful nature. That was a big change. But I think when the changes really became obvious, besides participating with David Sharner in Finland, and that was a yearly thing going on these retreats, and it's group interaction. So it's very it's transformative, because there's something that can happen in a group that doesn't happen otherwise. Really, one can see oneself from so many different angles, and it's very hard to actually not see, or to hide or pretend if you've got all these different ways in which you're letting yourself be seen. So those experiences were accumulatively transformative, and complementary with them. Two things happened. I mean, one after the other. One was I took on this house where I live now, which was a non-abandoned crack house. I mean, it was full of crack heads, and it was so bad, the house, that the estate agent didn't even want to show us it, and we couldn't get in. It took a long time to even get in because the occupants didn't want to let us in. But when we saw it, and it was as revolting as you would imagine a house like that would be, and just no light, no windows, just dark. So both of us, my wife and I, both of us felt almost immediately, oh yeah, we could do something with this house. So there wasn't, the visceral response of disgust was less strong than the feeling of there's hope here. Probably because I live in a town called Hope. There's promise, there's potential. And so we took this on as a project, and right away, I mean, I had this sense, we both did, that, okay, so this house represents our bodies, and that this cleansing and clearing out and renovating and restoring this, polluted, not abandoned, but, abused structure, restoring it to some beauty and making it habitable is going to be a way to enact something that we can't bring about through intentionality. I mean, obviously you can improve your diet and there's all kinds of things you can do, but how do you actually deal with these toxins that were put in you, 30 years ago or 50 years ago, in my case even in the womb? You can't really. So to have an actual enactment, I think you were touching on this earlier when you said about the space between the conscious and the unconscious and how things happen there, how the real stuff happens there. This was an opportunity to do that on different levels. Obviously it was metaphorical, but it was also literal. We were also involved in the project of creating our own place to live, or recreating it, or restoring it. So just the physical act of renovation, if anyone's ever done it, it's really hard, and it really requires an engagement that is non-mental. My mind did help me with that. That was a huge project, and then and that sort of led organically into taking over a thrift store just around the corner. And so since 2016, I've been running this thrift store with my wife, which caters to the poor. Everything's very cheap, and we buy food and distribute food once a week, and we give away clothes. It's not a charity, but it's just natural. I mean, a thrift store is for the poor, so they're going to come in, and some of the poor are just homeless and hopeless, and so it's we're in service to the community. And it's also a pretty hard job. It's pretty taxing. I see it as my reformed shaman side, because the shaman's all about clearing out the shit and transforming negative into positive, and working with the dark stuff and working with toxic garbage. And so that's what we're doing at the most ordinary social level. There's no sort of spiritualized, well, I am spiritualizing it now, aren't I, a bit, but
the alchemist in the thrift store.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. That's just for these interviews, that when I'm working at a thrift store, nobody's like, oh, hey, Mr. Alchemist, they're just, here, take this crap and don't give me any of your crap, kind of thing. I got to be it's a daily opportunity, let's say, just to keep opening and constantly be bringing order to chaos. I mean, literally that. So, I mean, I gave that answer because that to me is, I mean, I have this saying on my website, as within, so without. That's the best gauge, I think, of how we're, as I say, rubber. How does rubber meet road? You can spin that rubber, you can admire your vehicle all you want, but until it actually hits the road and hits 120 miles an hour, whatever, you're not going to find out how it's built and if it's going to take you where you want it to go. So all of none of this would really count for much if it hadn't led to a more embodied, a more relaxed, a more efficient, a more loving, a more open, a more receptive, a warmer way of coexisting with other human beings, even though that's not particularly my philosophy. Well, I'm quite a solitary person, even identify as autistic. I do prefer one-to-one conversations. I'm not really into community. You know, it's interesting because the values I had, they don't correspond actually with the way I live, which fortunately doesn't make me a hypocrite. It makes me better than I thought I was, like more responsible and more compassionate than I thought I was, in some ways that I would like to be. Actually, I'd like to be more selfish, and I try to be, because it's hard work, you know, serving the community, for example. Just as it's hard work really listening to one's body and saying, well, I'd really like that bag of potato chips, but what do you say, stomach? And the stomach's going, no. You're like, what do you mean no?
No, we will have that. Yeah.
I'm the boss here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd say becoming more responsible and more mature, and I mean, enjoying life more. It's, you know, it's for me, it's been very, very hard to enjoy life. I'd say I've had probably my first 40 years were pretty hard, and so for me, just developing a growing ability to enjoy life on a moment-to-moment basis, that's quite radical, and that does seem to correspond almost precisely with the life of the body, living the life of the body. The more I'm living the life of the body and listening to my life force, or at least tuning in, what's going on with you, life force? Because my mind's still saying, oh God, it's too hard, I'm so fucking sick of this shit. That's been my life's refrain for 50 years, really. So, and it doesn't change, you know, the record doesn't change, but the life force has a totally different song to sing.
That's fantastic. I mean, I really love the part, even with the house, it's sort of like a metaphorical and literal coming home in a sense, and a perfect description of as within, so without. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. So just as we come to just before we go to the closing question, just first of all, where can people connect with you, purchase your books if they want to purchase them? Where's the best place for them to find you?
Just the one place. I mean, I have YouTube and Twitter and whatnot, but the main place is the website, which is auticulture.com. So that's AUTI culture.
I'll put it in the show notes. And
there's if you could perhaps link to specifically to 16 Maps of Hell, which is the book that I'm just getting ready for publication now, the Unraveling of Hollywood Superculture, asterisk with a rough draft of the exit. So the objective of this book was to map hell sufficiently that I could identify the exit and say goodbye to hell, because I've been doing it for a very long time. And this corresponds with the body, I would say. You know, the trauma in the body is kind of like this map of hell too. So yeah, wanting to kind of knock that on the head. Anyway, that's what I'm promoting currently. Also, my podcast is called The Liminalist, and that's a weekly podcast that people can check out. I think that's probably all they need to know.
And I'll pop this.
I do like to, like as you contacted me after the Sean Atwood, that to me is that's the best result. Is like a direct person-to-person connection is made, and so that's what I would hope for. So if people would like to email me, they can just do that directly. It's Jasun with a U at protonmail.com.
Perfect. I'll put that in there. And I think I'm going to get the audiobook of the 16 Mats of Hell, because you go through 24 specific case studies, right, of actual celebrities, and you break that down. Yeah. Is that what's in there?
Well, that is still in there, but the form has changed enormously since then. So much less about case studies and about the deeper thesis that I discovered very much towards the end of writing the book. So in a way, Hollywood, as I hope with all my books, is just a lens through which to look at the collective human psyche, really, and what went wrong, what's gone wrong, and how it can become righted.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm going to check that out. So before we come to the closing question, I'd just like to take a moment just to acknowledge you, first of all. for, I love your integrated, it feels like an integrated approach to talking about some of these subjects that when you kind of go down those rabbit holes can get deeper, darker, and they're sort of harder to talk about topics. And what I loved about, which I commented on the YouTube video when I heard you with Sean Atwood, and today you're able to sort of put across the information in a way that I can actually, it's reflected back, I can actually put it in context of my own life and conditioning. And it took me out of the sense of overwhelm that I was getting by going down that rabbit hole. So yeah, I really appreciate that. And your use of language with it is really powerful. There's something about it beyond the words that resonates. So I wanted to, yeah, thank you for that.
Oh, well, thank you for saying it. I suppose Dave would say that's the transmission, the thing that the words, are just kind of thrown on top of so that we will pay attention. And the other thing that you mentioned, that's like the draft of the exit, I think, what you described as it landing in the body and finding context in a way that makes the darkness not unremitting. There's a spark of light in the darkness. There's a solution somehow that's hidden in all of that darkness. That I think is my idea about the exit. We can really make use of this stuff. We don't just have to obsess over it.
Sit around in the head, exactly. So a question I like to ask all my guests, just to finish up, would be, if you were to briefly define a journey to authenticity, what would you say that was? I know you've again
That's like a hard question, isn't it? That's very similar. I would say the gradual letting go of the need to define, I think. I had to dodge it.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on today. I found it, again, really fascinating. I could go down so many different avenues, but it's been a really great conversation. So thank you so much, Jason.
Oh, well, thank you, Sarah. It's been unusual for me because usually I get, on the conspiracy channels and whatnot. So this has been a new kind of experience.
Good. Wonderful.